Good afternoon. One of Mike Bloomberg's favorite sayings is, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." So in that spirit, we're going to start with a poll, which I know you've done earlier today. And we're asking, what % of personal wealth globally is controlled by women? I'll give everyone a minute. Can we see the... 15%, all right. So the least popular answer is actually the right one. It's 30%. That always makes it fun.
Oh, that's cheating.
And it's expected to climb to roughly 50% by 2025. So there's something very exciting happening around women and money right now. And increasingly, investors are waking up to the power of women as well. So with that to frame our discussion, Anne, I want to start with you. Every company says diversity is a priority. Mm-hmm. Mastercard was one of the first companies to disclose comprehensive data to back it up. Why?
Well, we actually believe that to run a global business, you have to have representation from around the world of the people that you're serving. And we have 2.5 billion products out there across 210 countries. And we just thought it made absolute sense for us to have the best mix of people to deliver our business results. And I think being transparent about it means that you're reporting the good and the bad. It really means transparent. On top of that, we are actually a data company. So we get what Mike Bloomberg's saying about data. It makes sense to us as one of the oldest and biggest fintechs in the world.
Helena, I believe today is the first anniversary of the Girl Fund. So you offer the investor perspective. Have you seen the returns you were hoping for?
Yeah, I mean, the Girl Fund is the first index-based fund based on UK equity market, but it's tilted towards those companies that are doing the most for women in their workforce, and not just women on boards. It's women in the executive, women in management, and women in the workforce, and then away from those companies that score the least. And a year on, I mean, it's early days still, but of course there was a lot of skepticism when we launched this, and I was asked so often on television and on Women's Hour, actually, which was slightly contradictory, about wasn't this going to be very detrimental to returns? Think all that through. It's kind of a bit of a sad reflection. But anyways, a year in, obviously this fund has pretty much tracked the index as it's supposed to do, but it's outperformed by roughly at 1.5%. And if one looks at the chart, it's nicely just sort of shown an incremental achievement, outperformance at every stage of the way. I think even more importantly, and echoing really the point about data, what we've discovered is that, of course, companies who perhaps didn't take this particularly seriously, even if they said that they were, once the data is exposed and once there's investments being made on the strength of it, then they have tended to do something more about it. So on average, the scores have increased by 8% across the 4 measures, which is pretty exciting because obviously we are still invested in, even apart from the really poor performers, those companies that maybe aren't doing so much, and we want them to take this as sort of constructive criticism really and do something about it. So the data is great, but it's a starting point. It's obviously not the result in itself.
That's exciting. You're seeing the returns and the improvement.
Yeah.
Nicolas, sometimes the financial services industry tends to have a negative reputation when you think about how welcoming it is to women. I think sometimes people hear women in finance and they still picture, a trading floor scene out of Wolf of Wall Street. How do you fix that perception?
It's an enormous work because, unfortunately, the situation is appalling in certain part of our businesses. You are referring to the financial services. I spend most of my time in the world of insurance, and the world of insurance is generally diverse when you look at it overall, but when you look at it in certain part of the market, the worst being the London insurance commercial market, you've got clearly a situation where there is a lack of diversity, both from a gender point of view and a technical point of view. I think what is, so it's an appalling situation, but what is brilliant in this situation is that awareness about the importance of the matter has developed in the latest, significantly in the latest 5 years, and corporations, CEOs have recognized that that was not going to be a matter that they would be able to address by themselves as individuals. So it's been decided to take that and to tackle that, to your question, as a market effort. There is a fantastic initiative which has been started 4 years ago, and we're quite proud at Willis Towers Watson to have been a participating founder of the initiative, which is called Dive In, which is a yearly festival. It reminds me, part of the discussion this morning, that it should not be a 3 days, hurrah, hurrah, and then nothing happening in 362, depending the length of the year. But there is a lot of activity going on. This is about sourcing the talent. This is about developing the talent. This is about sponsoring. But this is also essentially about developing awareness, because as I said, executives now have a genuine awareness about the matter. We still face a major issue within middle management, which has not yet well enough recognized. In fairness to them, we just recognize it. So we need to help them to recognize it.
That's a good point, that you have it at the top and perhaps the bottom, but the middle is where most of those promotion and hiring and comp decisions are happening. And what does a data-driven approach look like in Mastercard as far as holding managers accountable for these types of initiatives?
Well, we measure everything from, the number of women we bring in at entry level, which is it's actually over 50% right now. There's overall numbers of women in the company, 40%, and then we measure at every single layer in the company. We also measure, are we paying equally around the world? And when I was running everything outside America, because I ran the whole of international, I was traveling around the world for a couple of years, and I was saying to a lot of my managers, I want more women country heads. I want more women in senior management positions. And not much was happening. And then I started to say, OK, well, I'm going to personally look at every appointment of vice president and above. And I want to see the slate, and I want to ask why you put the candidate you chose in that role. When I did that, the number went up 10% more women in the first year, because people couldn't just put someone in the role they couldn't justify. I didn't ask for it to be a woman. I think it's very important you have the right person for the job, the right skills and so on. But I think senior managers taking a real interest in that whole personnel program and the people process and asking those probing questions are the way to cause change.
It's a great example of getting your hands dirty in a very simple way.
Yeah.
All right, with that, we're going to take another polling question. I'll take a little break. And this one is, let me remind myself, a famous 2009 study showed that the gender pay gap increases by how much after women give birth? Mm-hmm. All right, so we're a little closer this time. The correct answer is 20%, still kind of appalling. So Helena, you have 9 children. You must be working for free. I mean,
I think, I just calculating, I must giving them money.
Yeah, you're giving money back, yeah.
All right, I'm a bit depressed by that. No.
So why is that still happening?
I think it's symptomatic of all the things that we've talked about already. I think that there is still a massive cultural issue that a lot of these points are sort of slightly skirting around. We're measuring things, we have programs, we have initiatives, but actually there's still an attitudinal problem. And I think what we haven't seen is people actually sort of embed the theory in terms of actually not just how they're practicing, because they might do that for a particular role and they might sort of say, yes, I can fill the slate with a sort of diverse group, but actually, and Nicolas was touching on this, I suppose, in terms of some of the attitudinal, the behavioral problems. And I think when women go on maternity leave, we still haven't got this sense that actually it's a family. The man plays a part as well. There's a sense that actually women's role becomes diminished. Sometimes, of course, women want to have less high-octane role for at least a period after having a baby, but that shouldn't be consigning them to reduce pay for the rest of their careers. So I think it just pulls it together, like the gender pay gap. I know your colleague was saying, one of the criticisms of the UK's version of the gender pay gap is it doesn't adjust for roles, but that's the whole point.
Right.
it's highlighting that we're not given equal.
It's highlighting the roles, right?
Yeah.
Exactly, the high-paying roles. And she mentioned paternity or maternity leave. We talked earlier about companies sort of taking a more inclusive approach to benefits and recognizing that there is no such thing as a traditional family structure anymore, and that you think about elder care, child care, maternity leave, paternity leave. How does a company like Mastercard with 15,000 people around the world weigh the cost versus a benefit to the employee when thinking about those things?
Well, we decided a couple of years ago, well, I think it was 2016, that actually we would offer 4 months maternity leave and 2 months paternity leave everywhere in the world. That's actually the minimum we offer, because obviously if you're in Scandinavia, then it's higher than that. But in countries like America, you know, that's higher than the norm. And I think the thing that's interesting about that is, I think the thing that really changed things was the paternity leave, because it started to level the playing field for people taking time off, usually in their, 20s, 30s, 40s kind of thing. And, the men starting to be treated the same way as women. And the women actually benefiting from the fact that their partners, and it may not always be women, you can have men and women, but majority, the women really benefiting from the fact that, the company felt it was a good idea for men to stay off and be with their children earlier in life. And I think actually a lot of companies have this maternity, paternity leave set up. But the question you've got to ask yourself is, are the men comfortable taking the time off? Do you make it culturally acceptable? And we know in Mastercard, because we've been measuring it, that most of our guys are taking their allocation. And that's really an important message inside the company, because it says the managers are fine with this, the seniors in the company are fine with this. We think this is a great thing.
That's such a good point. I think one that a lot of organizations struggle with, because the other half of the policy is the confidence in taking it. I know at Bloomberg, when we first added paternity leave, we were very excited, then no one was taking it. And it wasn't until we had some senior managers do it, because then people felt like they had seen it was okay, it wasn't a trick,
Yeah.
Nicolas, you have a practice that advises companies on things like this. I mean, what are you seeing as far as trends in what companies are struggling with the most at the senior level?
Well, clients are clearly asking for help a lot. The first thing I think you referred to it, it's really about helping them in the analytics. Really helping clients on understanding their data, building up the data that's often not existing around pay, and diversity elements, whatever we can have and whatever is allowed, by the way, because we know that some of the analytics are not recordable in certain geographies and jurisdictions. The second point, which might be surprising, is a listening need. It's not good enough to have analytics, not enough to have data. It's about how you listen to your employees. And that's about organizing some surveys, pulse surveys, focused groups to really truly discuss the matters and get to the true practical challenges that are faced. And then it's about processes. The two most important ones are the pay processes and the talent management processes. And I think you gave a really good example regarding pay processes. And actually at Willis Towers Watson, we are ourselves, because we have our own sins, very vigilant on the matter. Executives are paying a lot of attention around how managers are managing the promotion rounds and the pay reviews. So helping our clients on those two elements, which are related to pay and talent management, are critical. There are other elements, but I would say those four are the critical ones. Surprisingly, the benefits is at the moment still coming at the last moment, after we would have supported the clients in terms of building an inclusive culture. So the change in culture is a big ask from the clients, and also overall building an I&D strategy, which still quite often is not there.
I'll just pick up on some of those points, because I think it's really important to recognize that this isn't like a special initiatives. And I think up until very recently, for most companies, they've thought, okay, we'll do some special programs and we'll sign up and we'll maybe pat ourselves on the back for doing all of this, but actually then business carries on just the same. And I think it's one of the reasons I'm continually struck by the disconnect between the sort of narrative that's out there and then what women particularly tell me if they work in financial services, where there's a litany of woes, really, and people are experiencing things that aren't really documented and they feel very trapped about whether they can raise it with anybody in their own company. And it is very striking because I think, well, why are they telling me rather than going and telling people that they work with? But they don't feel that there is a listening culture, and they feel still there's a fear of recrimination. And something that Deloitte has done in the last sort of 5 years is they've done a really intensive sort of from top to bottom program where they realized there was a series of problems, including with the treatment by clients of their staff sometimes. And so they created this actually, they almost fabricated because they had actresses play the role of the women told their stories, but then they didn't. Then they played a tape to 1,100 partners and then out to 1,500 managers in the UK, and they cascaded it. And some of the women played each other, so it wasn't identifiable whose story it was. And they talked about what had happened, how they felt about it, and then what impact it had on their psyche going forward. And it was the most powerful thing, the telling of the stories. And I've seen that. I'm the governor of a school where we've heard the stories again of somebody, it's a boys' school actually, but boys who are gay or Jewish and suffered anti-Semitism and so forth. And it's very, very powerful and emotively connects people. People don't like being told what to do, but you put these stories in front of people and they get it then. But it's how to do that while creating a safe environment.
The story point is a very, very powerful element. I just want to warn about some dangers that can come from that. We had a completely unfortunate situation as part of our diversity programs in Willis Towers Watson. We have a group working on ethnical diversity. And we had a fantastic external speaker that came to explain. The guy was a black man explaining what has been his career development. And at point, he was explaining one very, very specific element of discrimination he has suffered from. But very unfortunately, he said that he had decided to turn the page, not to report it, and to get along with it. And I had literally to jump on the stage because all my employees and colleagues were in the room, and I said, I'm afraid, you are a fantastic speaker, but I cannot leave you saying what you say, because that might have been right for you. As a CEO in this company, I don't want to admit this situation. So if any of you would suffer from this situation, you need to find a way to report it so that we address the situation. So the stories, that was an opportunity for me, to be honest, to use it, but that could be quite dangerous if nobody would have been in the room.
Right, yeah. to respond
to the challenge.
Yeah. But I do think the stories are important, and one of the things we were talking about, Kiersten, was financial inclusion. Yes. And I was pointing out that, there's a big gender gap in the sort of excluded world as well. Women, I think it's about 9% are more women than men. But we were saying, if you're born in somewhere like Africa, as a girl, there's parts where you're not registered at birth. You'll grow up, you may never have a driving license, you may never have a passport. So how do you actually get yourself included in the system? And we're saying that actually things like digital identity start to become very important for the world in this context, because you need to be able to identify people and actually use biometrics. That's where the new technology can actually help women on a global basis to be included. And the way to make people understand this is by telling a story about what it's like to be a girl born in certain parts of the world and to grow up and to be excluded from the financial system and to be farming and not to be able to sell your goods directly, always having to go through a middleman and so on. So I think these are powerful, Helena, and regardless of whether it's internal or it's external to the company.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of what Mastercard is doing for the greater good. And anyone here who's a terminal user knows biometrics. So I feel like that's not our most popular aspect of the terminal. I do want to come back to the sexual harassment that you mentioned. Helena, I'm hearing from some of our clients that they think about how effective a company's sexual harassment preventative procedures are and procedures for dealing with claims is a risk issue. And they almost put it in the governance category as opposed to the gender category. Is that something that resonates with you?
I think it's a good way to look at it, because I think what we struggle with, or what we have struggled with in some ways, is the gender diversity issue in particular has got a little bit fatigued and a little bit about sort of, oh, it's just a women's thing. Whereas obviously what we're talking about is everybody's thing, and going back to our early points is culture aspects as well. And I think what we haven't made is the connection between having, which we should be obviously, great workplace cultures, practices, modern, attractive places where young people want to work and stay and build in their career, and then being free from harassment and free from bullying, etc. And I think it's a good way, if we can recalibrate, get some more people interested in it at the very least, by looking at it as a risk, as a governance issue, then that's all great. It's just not getting siloed, not getting stuck in, oh, this is a subject for HR, or this is a subject for the women to sort out themselves. I mean, that was the breakthrough with the 30% Club that we've been all involved in, that actually it wasn't a women's issue, but it was men and women's issue to resolve.
No, I mean, engaging the men in this conversation is so important. Nicolas, since you're the only man on this stage, I mean, how do you take that responsibility as a leader and as a male leader at your firm?
It's not that I don't want to answer the question, but for me, the key point is that any form of discrimination is not acceptable. Any form of harassment is not acceptable. So the key thing is making sure that we build a culture which is totally inclusive and disciplined enough to call out any wrong behavior, what it is, whatever it is. So I think, of course, men have a responsibility versus the gender matter, but for example, white people have a responsibility versus the ethnical matter. So all of us have to take our own personal responsibility, I would say, as individuals, as professionals, and of course even more as leaders. But back to the cascading problem or challenge, we need to make sure that not only we demonstrate and lead by example, but that we help everybody in the company to drive the matter, because that's going to happen only effectively if every employees are participating. Back to, for example, any sexual harassment or any form of harassment is going to naturally happen at the coal face. How would you know as a CEO if you don't have the appropriate working environment and culture and ethical approach within all your firm so that people are taking the matter immediately and managing it?
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked a lot about what's happening inside of companies' four walls, and I know supplier diversity is something that Mastercard has really taken a stand on, and I find that area very exciting because I think companies of this scale can really, scale their impact in communities in which they operate. What does that look like?
Well, we decided that we would like to put big targets out there, and in 2015 we put a target out that said we want to bring the next 500 million people into the financial system. When you do targets like this as a company, you don't know how you're going to achieve them. It's just like you're discussing your budget, and you just know that your business managers around the world are going to come up with some great ideas to do it. And we're tracking against that now. I think we've got something like 370 million people that we've connected up so far. And actually, we're moving from connection to inclusive growth now, because we're saying it's okay, we're working with the telcos and the governments and the technology companies in the different countries to connect people, but it's no good unless people are using it. So let's think about real use cases. And one of the things, going back to the gender issue, is when women are running businesses, it's so hard for them to get credit. And so you have to start convincing the banks that women are worth investing in and giving them credit, often without collateral, because in many parts of the world, women aren't allowed to own property. And that's a problem. So we've been doing things like working with Unilever, who are supplying small shopkeepers, to say these shopkeepers are supplied by Unilever. If you lend them money, they can order more soap powder before their shelves become empty. And we're able, and this is back to the Bloomberg view of the world, we're able to get the data from the Unilever supply chain through to the small shopkeeper, through to the buyers, so that we can show that it's a viable business and take that data to the banks and say, on the back of this empirical data, please lend the shopkeepers money. And of course, many of these shopkeepers are indeed women. So it's all of these things, thinking about how we can use all of these things to get a more equitable society.
And that I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say money talks, obviously,
Right.
as well. Like investors can do much more, I think, around the gender issue as well. So on the supply chain, we're obviously an investor in so many companies, and yet so often people aren't sort of asking not just about, the women on the boards, but much more about, the culture, the engagement, the mentoring of women and so forth. And there's so much more, I think, that investors at the moment are being a little bit slow, I think, generally. Obviously not Legal in General. Obviously, that's
no one up here.
No one up here. But I mean, last year we voted against 108 chairs of UK companies who weren't doing enough on diversity issues, and people were sort of like, "Wow, that seems very aggressive to vote against." And we were like, "Well, they've had loads of time to think about it. Where's the plan? Where's the commitment? What are you doing about it?" And again, I think we'd love to see more follow us and actually not just sort of say, "Oh, well, it's not a single issue item," because of course there are lots of issues, but we should be using the vote. We should be creating the world we want to live in.
No, money definitely talks. I mean, I have to ask though, using your vote that way, do you ever find yourself conflicted because Legal in General has its own things it needs to work on?
Well, I think the important thing is to work on these things in parallel. I mean, that was definitely a hallmark of the 30% Club, that no one had to have 30% women on their boards to join it. I mean, the whole point was that you were aspiring to that. Within the investment industry here in the UK, we have something called the Diversity Project that I chair that is joined up, again, going back to that idea that you can't do these things in individual companies. It has to be across the whole sector, that there's issues that need to be resolved, even just to attract the women in the first place. And again, what we recognize is one of the reasons why investors might not be pushing so hard is because people are going to turn around and say, well, that's a bit of a pot calling a kettle black, as we'd say here, that actually it's, you can't throw stones at us when you've got so much to sort out. So doing the two things concurrently, it's going to take forever if we have to sort out our own house and then get on with others. You can't be hypocritical and say, you've got to be brilliant and I'm not going to be, but you can do both at the same time.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, one thing we've learned from companies being more transparent through our index is that every company on there has a pipeline problem. So in a way, while that's not ideal, it's a little bit more comforting that you can come out and say, here are the numbers I'm proud of, here are the things I want to work on. And like you said, not hold your cards close to your chest until you reach parity, which we always hear is going to be when our kids are dead. So I think that is probably better. I always say that it's like going on a diet. You don't wait until you lose 50 pounds to buy a new dress. You kind of celebrate the milestones along the way.
Or you buy a dress in the first place because you're not going to lose the
right. There you go. Yeah. And the scale doesn't lie, just like data. So there you go. Nicolas, what's the next frontier of this conversation? You hear from so many companies around the world. What are we not talking about?
Probably what we're not talking about is that diversity is a global and very complex matter. And we need to recognize that it's connecting to macro challenges that we have around the world. So I think this morning the climate, for example, came into the discussion. That's going to impact dramatically a part of people that we consider here as diversity, but they are the majority in those geographies. So I think when we consider diversity, we need to look at it on a much more holistic point of view. So the way we look at how we should run the world, how we should be more inclusive, more supportive to each other, more respectful, is probably a macro-political topic. So sorry to bring it like that in the conclusion, but I think it's an element connected to what we are trying to do in our respective companies.
Well, that's a great segue to, I want to end by asking all of you sort of what is at stake, what is most at stake for your company if you don't get this right?
The business. Because, I mean, I don't think we've used the word since this morning, but human resources is our critical asset. So, of course, some companies and some industries are asset-heavy, financial assets, but in professional services like us, this is the only asset we have. So this is not only a business case, it's how do we leverage the human resources as the key asset we have. So bringing talents, developing the talents, retaining the talents. This is the whole life of our business day to day.
Yeah, we're all in a war for talent.
Yeah.
Anne?
Absolutely, I think completely the same. I mean, we want to be a preferred employer. We want to be a preferred brand, and we also want to be a preferred partner of many different companies around the world. Our whole business model is partnership. And I know that we look at our suppliers and partners and ask how they're running their businesses. I expect them to do that of Mastercard. And I think that way, the whole business is at risk if you don't get this right.
I like that you're asking your suppliers. It's kind of like the investment community using, their power for good as well. Helena?
Yeah, I think it's critical to recognize if we don't get this right, we won't be able to not just be struggling to attract the best women, but we'll be struggling to attract the best men as well. I think young people, I have a huge sample size, are very, very adamant that they expect to work in a place where their sisters and their brothers are treated equally, where they would think of it as very odd to have a lopsided environment. They expect a very different workplace than their parents. I had said last time I was on Bloomberg TV, I said women are the trade of the decade, or if not longer. And I do think there's a commercial missed opportunity if you're not on top of this as well.
All right, well, it's a complex challenge, a lot to do. But thank you all for joining us. This is very helpful to have a window into what your companies are doing.
Thank you.